Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 29 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that Curt and I have been shooting back and forth emails about all week, and we're excited to bring this to our audience. The title we're using, and we'll define these terms very quickly as we move into the topic, pop behavioralism, intrinsic motivations, and trauma. So we've got a fun topic today, and I think a topic that really, no matter what field you're in, whether it's education, social services, public health, is really relevant to our thinking. And I know my conversations with Curt and some of the readings that I've been doing lately have really challenged some of my past assumptions in, I think, really healthy ways. I haven't fully come up with fully formed conclusions yet, but I'm in kind of the fun part of the process where I'm really looking at things in a different light. And we're going to share some of the conversations we've been having back and forth in emails with you all and see what we come up with through the hour we have together today. So Jerry's back in Florida, Curt. I guess he's golfing again. I don't know if he goes for work. He just tells us he's going to Florida. So I'm not sure Jerry knows how to watch our podcast when he's not on it, but if you're watching, Jerry, we miss you. So I hope you're at par or whatever you're supposed to do with golf. I don't know anything about golf. I think par is good. So
yes, par is good.
Par is good. Good. So Curt, before we dive into this, what's your bright, shiny object for the week?
Two things, and interesting you mentioned Jerry, because that's one of them. And in springtime, really, I just love it. It's such a fun time of year. And for those that are in Colorado, you know that we got snow the last 2 nights, but it'll be 80 degrees by Saturday. That's springtime in the Rockies. So I really enjoyed just the change in weather and a little more warmth and a little more sunshine. That's been really nice. And then certainly thinking about Jerry doing what he loves to do, right? That's just such a fun thought. I mean, Jerry's been such an important professional and personal figure in my career that to think about him doing something that he just loves to do and being out there enjoying it and probably cursing himself a little bit because he wants to get better. That's just it's a nice, happy thought for me. So that's my bright, shiny object of this week.
Awesome. Yeah, it just seems like the most analyzed round of golf. I just would like to watch him drive the cart around and see what that all looks like in reality. But we definitely wish you the best, Jerry. And so my object of the week is a lot of reading I'm doing for a project that's I'm not quite ready to announce what it is yet because it's still in the formulation phase, but really re-looking at a lot of how we manage behavior. And a lot of this is kind of the inspiration for the topic that we have today, but really looking at how especially in my work in residential settings and housing settings where honestly there was a 24/7 level of control that I had over the clients in the programs, and that word doesn't roll off my tongue really well, but that was
part of the control, man.
I know, I have to admit it. And so with being that, one of the things that I really have paid attention to is this idea of pop behavioralism. And I'm reading this book right now from Cohn, Alfie Cohn, is that right? You guys know I'm terrible with names. And he used this term, and I thought, hey, I'm a master's level clinician. I've had several hours of graduate training in behavioralism in my time. Granted, it was a while ago. But I just started to really realize how many people, including myself, who don't have the training that Curt has, try to take the reward, punishment, incentive sort of models that we all kind of learned about if you ever had a psychology 101 class or history of psychology, when you learned about Skinner and Watson and all the behavioralists, and try to apply those to people in our programs. A lot of clinics, even you think about folks that may not have that level of quote unquote control, and really looking at like 3 strikes you're out rule. If you're late for 3 appointments, you're no longer in the clinic. Trying to integrate these things, these controls, and Curt, I'll let you give plenty of time to correct my language, to try to get the behavior that we're looking for. But at times, what I really see within myself is we probably didn't put nearly enough time into thinking why we were doing this. None of it seemed to be working, to be honest with you. We always had a lot of behavioral issues. A lot of times that's why the kids were in my programs to begin with. But then there's the trauma piece that comes in, and this whole new neurobiology that we're learning about, which helps understand the behaviors in a whole different way, why these kids seem more reactive, why these kids and adults are quicker to snap, why it's harder for them to get re-regulated once they get triggered, re-traumatization and the intensity of behaviors that may seem illogical to us. So really looking at all these things, and now when I put that trauma-informed lens back on the level systems, the point systems, the light systems, the token systems, if you could laminate it, I had it. And I really kind of enjoyed trying to figure out how we could help kids improve behavior. But then I look at some of the research in trauma and I'm like, that no wonder we weren't really getting the results that we were really looking for. So with this, I would like to throw out, and really, Curt and I haven't had this conversation yet. So Curt, I just kind of want to start. I want to look at pop behavioralism and intrinsic motivation from both of our perspectives. So I've sort of given a little bit of my thinking right now on the pop behavioralism, but I wonder from your perspective, who has, where I had several hours, you had probably several hundred, if not thousands of hours at this point of training, reading on behavioral approaches. And I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that concept of pop behavioralism and just some of your perceptions on what people like me are doing out there in the world.
Yeah, I think a couple of things, and I'll start with this first one, which is how we use the word behavioral. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important to make a distinction between one way that we use that word, which is relating to behavior. Right? That's behavioral. It's just relating to what people do.
Yeah.
Or animals, like whatever kind of behavior you're talking about. And then the other side of behavioral is talking about the theory and philosophy of behavioral science. And those two are very different things. Like they are not equal. So, and they get interchanged a lot, right? So we'll talk about a behavioral approach as one being informed by the philosophy and science of learning. That's a very different thing than saying a behavioral approach in the sense of meant to manage behavior. They are entirely different. And I often kind of start this conversation, which I have more frequently than I would care to say. I kind of go back to the history of what the philosophy and science of learning and behavior analysis, what drove it. Because I think it's important to understand that historical context. And I think you and I may have had this conversation once before, but bear with me.
It's a good one.
If you haven't heard it, right, is that Watson and Skinner too. And Skinner made some important changes from where Watson was. Mm-hmm. Really what drove them was looking for a research methodology that was sufficient to be called scientific. And so all of those years ago, the major scientific method of doing research in the field of psychology was what we called introspection. And people, if you can look it up, right? It was a whole training thing that you had to get your grad students to go through, where they could be trained to really try and effectively label what their experience was and report while they're going through some experimental preparation of what did I see in this situation, or what did I feel in this situation? What did I hear in this situation? So they would use specific words to characterize environmental events, like redness, right? The color. It was really a complicated research methodology. And Watson basically said, that doesn't fit to a natural science-based approach to understanding how we learn as a research methodology. And so that's where this idea came from of saying, if we're going to use a natural science-based approach, it has to be based on data that can be objectively verified and measurable and countable. And that's where behaviorism is to this day, right? That still is talked about a lot, right? And we talk about it in how we write treatment plan objectives. We talk about it in how we write business objectives. Even when you look at the science of neurobiology and the science psychology has come a long way in terms of adopting scientific method. That's the scientific method. Right? Even when we use questionnaires and when we use other types of methodologies, those questions are still critical to the science and to the research. And that's been a very significant move forward in the field of psychology in general, is the adoption of this kind of natural science-based research methodology. It's made a huge difference in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge thing. Skinner made some more thoughts and more ideas about that. That was, you've kind of heard this quote I say about Skinner a lot, right? He said this 60 years ago, that someday the physiologists of the future will be able to tell us what's going on inside the skin. He's like, but we don't know right now. So I'm going this way with my research methodology. Yeah. We know now, like now we have technology where we can see it a lot. And Jerry would kind of caution us all and say, we know a lot, but there's still a lot we don't know. We're still finding out things that we don't know, which is true and important to think about. But we're now at a point where, when I hear people in the trauma kind of space, or in the trauma world, talking about how learning history has impacted what a person does today, I'm like, you sound like a behavior analyst. Like that's what we talk about all the time. And when I hear behavior analysts talking about how, that same thing back and forth, I'm like, why can we not talk to each other? Like, we agree on all of these things.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly one of my kind of thoughts as I jump into this conversation, is really to understand that the philosophy and science of behavior was not generated in the sense that we didn't ever think that thoughts and feelings weren't important. That was never the driver for why this philosophy and science got developed. The driver was to get a viable research method. And like I said, now we have different research methods and different measurement techniques where we can really start to see and observe, like, the thoughts and the feelings that we have and the physiology that we have. We're starting to be able to observe those, and they meet the qualification for observability, measurability, and countability that science dictates that we do. And that's not just behavioral science, that's science.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's some of my kind of initial thoughts.
Great. And one of the things that, I think I took away, and I think if you get the amount of Skinner that I got, you sort of walk away, and then you walk into my first job ever as I was getting this thinking, and I got some in undergrad as well. But if you do X, you will get Y. Like that's like Pavlov, right? If you give food and ring a bell, eventually all you got to do is ring the bell to get the salivation. And so it became, and I really grabbed onto that because I was trained in what I call the horrible time of psychology, where they trained us to be eclectic therapists. And otherwise, I knew enough to be dangerous in like 20 different modalities. I wasn't really trained to be good at any one of them, but I could be bad. I could be a bad Gestalt therapist, a bad behavioralist, a bad cognitive behavioral therapy. But behavioralism was such key because of the science behind it. At least we had some data there. And then the cognitive behavior was starting to move up too, because they were using some of these approaches and getting some success with tweaking that sort of inside the skin as far as emotions and thinking are sort of concerned. And so the one thing that I look back at my early self, is that when I structured a lot of these reward, negative consequences, but punishment is kind of what it was. And I think what I missed that I got earlier or later in my career was trying to figure out, was there any room for intrinsic motivation? And now that I do a lot of training and thinking about the cognitive behavioral approach of motivational interviewing, one of the things that we see coming out of the motivational interviewing is that if we can help people find their own motivation for change and talk about the reasons, their desire, reason, and need for change, that we now again have that scientific evidence to show that that actually leads to changes in behavior. Where I was trying to get that where, hey, and some of this breaks my heart to say, just so our audience knows it, hey, if you behave this week, you can have a home visit. And some of that just hurts me inside to say, I was using whether or not you got to see your mom as a reward for your behavior. And so there's some of this where we were holding these really, I think in some ways unethical things over kids' heads because we were just thinking about that, do X, we'll get Y from that. And now what we see, at least coming out of the MI research, which is maybe one of the best cognitive behavioral research practices out there, is if you can find it in yourself, if you can find the words to verbalize your motivation, what we know is that's actually the X that helps predicts the Y instead of me imposing a structure upon you. And I just kind of wanted to get your thinking as we start to look inside the skin a little bit, which I think is what we're doing when we help people talk about and consider and sit with in a regulated way their, again, desire, reason, and need for change. Where you see from your perspective this internal intrinsic motivation coming.
It leads me to a question I want to get your thoughts about,
Great.
Which is the word natural consequences. Right, so that one comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Or as I'll kind of talk about, how do I say, the group of people who are, I would say, at times unfairly critical of a behavioral approach. And I mean that behavioral in the sense of informed by the science of behavior.
Yeah.
That we feel okay about somebody experiencing the consequences of their behavior if it's not arranged, right? We're okay with that. Even if that's painful, and even if that's we can see it coming, and even if we could avoid it, somehow we're like, no, I'm okay with that. That was a natural consequence. They need, how many times have you heard the phrase, they need to experience the natural consequences of their behavior? Yeah. Right. And that's, for me, I kind of get a little bit of a struggle with that. I'm like, why are we okay with that? But we're not okay with making things more pleasant. Even if we arrange them to be more pleasant. Yeah. But we're not okay with that. I get confused. So how do you think about those two things?
Yeah. Well, to me, natural consequences, it was a word that came, again, juvenile justice is maybe the worst place to start your career, to try to find really, and it was a terrible, or, it doesn't exist anymore. So it's I can say bad thing. It was staffed with the people that probably should have been locked up in some facility somewhere. And we just didn't do a good job. So we use that word a lot. Well, natural consequences. And that was sort of a way, again, of deflecting blame onto the individual. Now, as I step back from and put the trauma-informed lens on it, one of the most powerful pieces of research that has hit me, and this hit me is in my heart and soul. A lot of things an epiphany in my brain that will be my bright, shiny object and I'll obsess about for a long time, is that kids, especially coming from dysregulated home lives, don't understand cause and effect. And I always like to use the example to think about a kid, and I you can see the behavior on how this gets in is they come home. This is just a very simple example. they do the dishes on Monday after school to try to make mom happy. Mom comes home, she's not drunk. She praises the kid gets ice cream for doing this. So there's that reward there that happens naturally. Now, I was lucky enough to be raised in a home that Tuesday, if I did the same behavior, I would also get some positive feedback from that. But whether mom's struggling with a mental illness or on Tuesday, mom gets drunk on the way home from work, kid does the exact same behavior. And instead of being met with praise, now the kid's met with maybe being put down, maybe being screamed at, or potentially, as we all too often know, worse. And so when I started to think about the kids I worked with before I got this knowledge, all of a sudden, so many of these kids would say, I didn't do anything wrong. And I'm like, well, you're on level 2, and these are like, of my 8-level system, and these are the expectations of a level 2 kid. Of course, you broke my expectations. They're right there on the board. But a lot of these kids, now that we, again, sort of see this emerging science coming out and damage the prefrontal cortex and other things, is that if you come into my kind of well-structured behavioral program, but never learn the basics of cause and effect, I think what seem like natural consequences are these kids haven't developed the skills yet to really even consider and step back and say, what's going to be the consequence of my behavior? So that's one of the things when I see natural consequences, I cringe as well right now, is that it's like, okay, yeah, you did X or Y happened because you did X, but did you really consciously choose to do X? Or is that you either reacting to stimulus in the environment or not understanding that this consequence was going to even happen? Sure. And I think about, I didn't do anything wrong, and how many thousands of times I heard that. And not to say that some of those kids weren't pulling my leg. I mean, I'm not saying a lot of them were teenagers. But at the same time, I look at that in a very different way right now, is that, yeah, the behavior we could look back as being rooted potentially their traumatic history, attachment, all that, which gives me a whole different perspective, empathy and compassion, and again, a little hurt in my heart for all those kids that I thought were choosing those behaviors, and that whether we called it negative consequences or not, we really punished.
Right. I mean, there are a few things in what you just said. I'll kind of try and unpack them a little bit. One of the things that is a big challenge with the quote unquote natural consequences, right, is a fundamental principle that we have learned from research on behavior and interactions between behavior and environment, is that the more of a delay that there is between any event that follows behavior and the behavior itself, that delay makes it much more difficult for the individual to connect those two things together. And that doesn't have to be consciously, right? That doesn't have to be that we can verbalize that. That's just how our bodies are organized. Right? Our brains and bodies are organized such that when we do things, what happens right after it has an impact on the future probability of us doing that again. Very adaptive ability of us. Very adaptive. It helps us to avoid dangerous things. It helps us to be able to go towards things that are valuable to us. If we lose that, we lose a really, really fundamental part of our ability to survive and be effective in the world. So as those delays get bigger, right, that's one of the fundamental problems of human behavior, is delays between when we do something and what the consequence of that action is. And by consequence, that can be a pleasant thing as well. That's just any event that follows behavior that we're thinking has an effect on it, right? So one of the things that's really driven the development of kind of token and level systems is designing some way to bridge delays between when a behavior happened and when the consequence of it is, right? So let's say, in your example, kid does the dishes, and we would love to have a parent come home right afterwards and be very, very happy and provide some praise and some positive feedback about that particular behavior that was done. And they may not come home for hours. Right? Or that may be that we see it happen in the moment and we're like, oh my goodness, I would love to give you ice cream or, whatever, right? And we're like, but I can't do it right now. So I need something to bridge the delay.
Mm-hmm.
And that can really help with this aspect that you're talking about of understanding and learning cause and effect. Right? It's an externally designed intervention that has the purpose of helping to really solidify that cause and effect or serve and return kind of relationship between child and environment.
Yeah.
And it helps, it really is a structure for caregivers to be able to do that more consistently.
Let me ask you, because I at the one of the interesting things, and I wasn't at this workshop, but at the Trauma Sensitive School Conference, Jerry was, and we talked about it because I thought this was fascinating. I'm sort of seeing this idea again in the reading that I'm doing, again, sort of around the cognitive behavioral approaches to this sort of environmental management, whether, again, that's in a school or a treatment center. And one of the things that I've heard a few times, I'd love to get your impact, because it goes, I think, a little bit counterintuitive to what you're saying, but usually when I think that, we actually are speaking much more the same language. And a lot of what I heard from Jerry, what he heard in his workshop is, we actually want to try to have a delay. And the logic behind that is that we want really people to start to understand the why behind the consequence that's going to happen. So too often, I see this in schools still, there's a behavior, and then let's say there's a fight that happens. There's immediate intervention of suspending the kid from school.
Right.
And you have to, safety is always our priority. Our jobs are extremely hard because we got to balance all of this.
Yeah.
So then there's that consequence, which I would argue suspending a kid that I work with from school.
It might not be a punitive consequence.
It's actually potentially an award, because sitting at home smoking weed and playing Xbox might be more fun for them than math class. So just to throw that out there. But what I've heard, some of these approaches that are challenging my thinking, is if we can sit and have a attuned conversation with the kid about what happened to cause that behavior. I think a great example is around bullying. I've heard this in a couple different places I've worked with, is when people have said, okay, what's behind this behavior? Well, my dad tells me if you're not the one picking on people, you're going to be picked on.
Right. We
now,
gain more understanding.
Yeah, if I understand the why behind, okay, so what happened to get that fight caused, and I dig down deeper, okay, well, mom came home drunk last night. I think we both, with kids struggling with developmental disabilities, at the school I ran, we could actually predict, like, it would take 5 days for kids to process their home visit, and then we'd see this spike in behavior 5 days after. So when you start to have those connected conversations, behavior, connection, talking about the event and the why behind the event, and then potentially, again, a consequence.
So you're thinking about the delay between when misbehavior happens.
Yes.
Right? And when we talk about the misbehavior.
More so the ability to connect before the reward or punishment happens. To start to get a why under this. What's your, what happened to, and to really to process it. Yeah. So I don't just jump a token for this, take away a point for that, take the light down for this, but there's a delay in that. The consequence may still be out there, or maybe even the reward might still be out there.
So let me be clear about one thing.
Okay.
For sure. I don't know, I say this honestly, I don't know any well-informed behavioral approaches, and I say behavioral in the terms of informed by the science of behavior.
Yeah.
That would advocate punishment as a major and primary driving force behind any token and level system.
Absolutely.
That moving people down a level or taking tokens away is never the first thing that we would ever suggest doing. In fact, that would be the very last thing we would ever suggest doing.
Yes.
Right, so that's just not even informed by the science of behavior.
Right.
Certainly there are a couple of very narrow circumstances where that is actually indicated. Some of the literature around conduct disorder, some of it around oppositional defiant disorder, is that is an important component of treatment for those particular disorders. But that's very narrow, and it's a small component of it. It's not the largest component of those kind of programs. So, and this delay, I think, is really important. Mm-hmm. One, I think it's especially important on the debriefing side, in the teaching of an empathetic response. Right? And doing that, and here's the trauma-informed part, I think, is that doing that right when the person has just probably been overwhelmed, and that's what drove a lot of this, whatever we'll call misbehavior, right? Whatever caused a problem. Yeah. Right? They're escalated when that happened. Mm-hmm. And the aftermath of that is that we had to usually set some limit around it. Setting limits always increases anxiety. It does not decrease anxiety, right, in the short run. And so doing a debrief about what the impact of that person's actions were on everyone else around them is not likely to go very well. Mm-hmm. It's not the right time to do it. And so putting a delay in there actually increases the probability of them being able to engage productively in that conversation, where you can have it in a way that we're not all stressed out, that we're not all dysregulated, that we can do it when we're calm, when we're able to think flexibly, when we're able to regulate and we're able to relate with each other. Mm-hmm. And in the moment and right after is not the time when that's most likely to be an effective intervention. Yeah. So I think that's really where a lot of this is. And of course, thinking about it, down as you go into inserting delays, right? Teaching a tolerance to delayed reinforcement is an actual procedure within the behavioral sciences. Mm-hmm. And it's an important one, right? That you may need to be able to start out with very immediate reinforcement. So you might need to use something like a visual representation of progress towards a goal. That's a very good, and that's very behavioral. Like that's very token oriented, right? And you would always want to move that towards being able to connect. If I do this, this good thing will happen. If I do this, this potentially negative thing would happen. And I use my brain, my frontal cortex, to help me make a decision between which one of those options I want to take. That would always be the goal of it. Mm-hmm.
So what do you think when we look at, intrinsic motivation or intrinsic control? Because one of the things that I've had to reflect on through the reading is why do we see the behavioral change? Because if we just see, and I'd love to get your thinking on all of this, because I think this is a larger question, is a lot of times what I was trying to get people to do, and again, I don't think I would have said this in the same way, this is with hindsight, is to get a certain behavior because you were afraid you were going to lose your home visit, which again breaks my heart that I use that as a carrot or a reward. But also we did this a lot with rewards as well. And again, I know it's not called punishment, but removing an award where, hey, now the rest of the class gets a pizza party, but you don't, because, I think that can seem like a punishment if we're honest about it too, with that piece. But one of the things that I've really been thinking about is that let's just say that we're using a token thing where you collect those for the good behaviors and following expectations throughout the day. So if I'm in a residential treatment center or a school setting and I'm doing that, I might see a change in the behavior because I would argue kids with skills to get the tokens will rack up the tokens. But I've also wondered, okay, what's my final end with this? Am I trying to control a behavior in my setting, or am I trying to help a kid be successful outside the setting? Because that's where I see intrinsic motivation being so important, is they carry that out with them. Whereas I'm afraid that my tokens and my green lights and my reward systems, if you're working to get the reward, well, if you're in a system like a workplace where that reward may not exist anymore or changed in some ways, where the paycheck kind of becomes normal, that you just get that, then where's my motivation to achieve, behave, or whatever behavior that we're sort of looking at? So I've been fascinated to ask you is, how does getting a token, these sort of the reward systems that we've been talking about, how do we get that to translate beyond that specific behavior in that specific environment to carry that with you outside and generalize into other settings?
Right, right. I mean, the question is about habits, right? And how do we generate habits? Right. So, however we do them, they become habits, and we're actually primed to create lots and lots of habits.
Yeah,
they are great shortcuts, great efficiencies in how we act. And one way to generate them is with some contrived environmental arrangements. Right? And if you're really kind of, I mean, this idea of kind of being self-actualized, right, is looking at your environment and going, how do I need to arrange my environment so that it supports the habits that I want to generate?
Yeah.
Right. That we're okay with that.
Yeah.
You know, so that's one way I think, thinking about that as a way of, can we generate some good habits here? And those habits are always done with repetition. No other way to do it. Like they have to be repeated at least a few times in order to become habits. It's kind of the definition of it. And then they happen automatically. So one way of thinking about how we arrange our environments is to support good habits and to make it more likely that those things will get repeated within the environment that we're arranging. And then it starts to increase the probability that those things will happen outside of that environment. But to your point, there's an extensive body of literature all about generalization and all about how do you answer the question that you're asking. Really, there's a lot of literature on it, on how you use specific strategies to encourage whatever habit you've generated in your kind of contrived situation outside of it. And there are lots of ways. I mean, there's one kind of seminal article called "The 7 Strategies for Generalization," and it's got 7 specific strategies for how to do it. And a well-trained behavior analyst would know those and would think about them in designing those kinds of things.
Cool. So let me, with habits, because this is another kind of question that's been floating around my head is, so you've been able to, again, manage the majority of the behavior. You've got healthy habits as far as paying attention, raising your hand, showing up to your medical appointment on time. How then, from your perspective, because I healthy habits are good. I try to have as many healthy ones that I don't have to think about, but
the unhealthy ones are easy to generate, right?
Exactly. If you're interested in my blog post, I go through everything healthy I do before my prefrontal cortex gets online, because the shake's already made. I've gotten a habit of taking the supplements I need to take. So I've really thought about that as just, if they're available and I get in the habit, I don't have to think about it, then I get that brain power for the work. So you've got that structured environment, which creates habits, which, promote behavior. Let me ask you, because I think one of the things our education system struggles with at times, especially when we don't have the right professional capacity in the classroom to really promote this a lot of times, is you've got that highly structured thing, the system that gets you habits. How then, because I see creativity, which in many ways is thinking differently and outside the habits and struggling with a new problem and trying to find, in the workplace, we would call that kind of innovation. In the classroom, we would want that creativity. So where do you see sort of that coming in with this sort of focus on that structure? Where does the structure allow then for creativity to come forward?
So I'll go back to some really cool studies that were done in, I'm probably saying it wrong, I think it was in the 1960s, by a woman named Karen Pryor. She's written a book called "Don't Shoot the Dog," which is a great kind of easy read about understanding behavioral science. And she did some really fascinating work on creativity. And she did it at Sea Life Park and with porpoises. And what she did is, this is a training site, right? So it was an animal training site. And certainly you can make arguments about the translational value of animal research to humans, but this was a pretty interesting one that I think is worth talking about. And basically what she did is she wanted to be able to see if a structured approach using fish as a reinforcer, right, which they would always, and a whistle would be paired with fish so they could mark when a specific behavior happened, because they couldn't give the porpoise a fish immediately. They had to use the whistle to mark when that happened to bridge the delay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what they did is to specify that porpoise, in order to earn a fish at some point in this study, had to emit a response that nobody had ever seen before. And they arranged a actual reinforcer for creativity, and they got lots of creativity. And so I think about that in the work environment, right? I mean, I think about a lot of the leadership stuff about when you're in team meetings. Right? One I think a lot of as a leader is be the last to speak. Right? Let other people give their opinion before you give yours. You're going to get a lot of creativity that way.
Yeah.
And also to be the one to always ask questions and make sure that you're encouraging people to talk and give ideas. Like that, I think about just arranging those environments to support creative responses.
Yeah.
I think for me, that's kind of where I go with that. And I think the same in a classroom, right? You can arrange that classroom. So I think Jerry kind of did this stuff a lot with me when he was kind of coaching me on leadership. So when you brainstorm, like make sure that you're the one who is the one who can either encourage brainstorming to happen, or you can end it real quick. So like as soon as you start asking evaluative questions about an idea, brainstorming's over. You have to ask clarifying questions. So you as the leader have to be the one to hold that and create that environment. As a teacher, right, you're in that position where you're asking questions and having periods of time where we're not going to ask any evaluative questions. We're just going to write it up on the board, right? Next idea, we're going to write it up on the board. So I think, and I think that's what a lot of the leadership books are kind of getting at, is that as leaders, what we say and what we do and how we act function as reinforcers and punishers among our teams. They either encourage things to happen or they discourage things to happen. And thinking about how we do that and arranging our team environment so that we support enough creativity and support a lot of communication by how we say and how we interact with our team members is critical to that. And I think about Karen Pryor's research with that a lot. There's been additional research since then about a lot of different species' ability to generate novel patterns and which is creativity, right? They're generating things that nobody's ever seen before. And the environment is arranged such that the reinforcer happens when novelty occurs. Yeah. And that increases novelty.
Yeah, absolutely. Which again, I think looks at our education system, and I think is a big challenge is, are we rewarding conformity, AKA the standardized testing that everybody seems to hate at this point? I'm sure there's somebody somewhere that likes it because we still do it, but you know, to me, that's in some ways like the conformity and teaching to the test, because then the school has to conform to that. And you know, where do we have space for that creative thinking, whether it's in the classroom or otherwise as well? I want to throw out another concept here, because one of the things that I've really realized with the trauma research, again, and thinking about that home where the kid gets one reaction from mom while she's sober and attuned with the child, and then on the next day gets a very, very different, almost opposite response. And how kids growing up in chaotic, traumatized environments, we know have a harder time connecting X behavior to Y, whether it's a natural consequence or whatever we want to call it, or a systematic consequence, having trouble doing that. One of the things that I've really, and I've taken my work in motivational interviewing with this as well, is the why the behavior or the rule or the expectation is important. And I watch this, I kind of make fun of my peers out there or my friends who have these small children around, because 2-year-olds are fascinating to me because they just seem to want to destroy themselves. Like they look, I like, you go out to dinner with somebody with a 2-year-old in tow. A, you're not going to have a conversation with them. B, you're just going to watch this little thing try to destroy itself. Like anything that can put itself in danger, it does. But I watch my parents to say, hey, you know, if you put that knife in the electrical socket, this will happen. If you pull the dog's tail, this will happen. If you put that knife in your eye, this will happen. Sort of that social learning thing. And occasionally, you know, if you hang around with a 2-year-old long enough, they're going to do one of these things and find out, okay, mom and dad aren't totally stupid. One of the things that I've really paid a lot of attention to in my thinking when I train educators now is not only going over the rules, and especially if you're working with a highly stressed, traumatized population in the classroom or treatment center, or even boundaries and expectations in a more case management, counseling, healthcare situation, is we not only need to go over the expectations and rules, but the why behind those. Because again, when that connection hasn't been made through my childhood, because the home life was dysregulated, I sort of lose the why behind that. And I think when you look at the MI literature and their focus on, you know, change oftentimes happens, or at least cognitive dissonance does, which is the stress to either realize an unrealized better future, or realization that my life has negative consequences that my life would be better if I got rid of, when there's a disconnect between our behaviors and our values. In other words, why the change is important. And I just kind of want, when we think about creating safe environments for individuals that may not be coming in necessarily with a really good internal way to say, okay, if I do this in the waiting room, this is going to happen to me. I wonder that sense of why, and taking time to explain why we have boundaries, why we have expectations, why we have classroom rules, seems to me in my research incredibly important and often missed in this whole thing. And I just kind of would love to get from your perspective, getting that really common understanding of the why behind all of this structure that we put on folks. What do you see that's important as well, and what role does that play?
Yeah, I do. I see. I've done a lot of kind of like behavioral programming things like this, you know, and have my own kind of clinical sense of what works and better, and what works a little bit not as better, so to speak. And certainly giving everybody who's going to be impacted by whatever system you put in place the ability to provide input into it is really important, and it goes much better. So I think that's also important to thinking about how human beings have a unique ability to follow rules that we don't know that any other species can do, because we can't talk to them, right? So we don't know. But in the behavioral literature, there is, of course, there's a distinction between what we call rule-governed behavior and contingency-shaped behavior, and that generating either one it is a very different experience. Like you were, you know, talking about a child running around, like, you know, holding a paper clip, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, don't put that in the light socket!" Right? Yeah. The kid doesn't know. Yeah. The kid doesn't know it's dangerous. Yeah. And one of the things that humans can do is learn not to put something in a light socket because it's going to hurt without doing it. Yeah. We don't have to do that. We can learn it from another person. Yeah. Animals can do it by watching other animals. And there's a lot of great literature about animals' ability to watch by observing others. And humans are really good at that. Yeah. One of the great benefits of being such a social species. And so I think that the why part of things, and especially from the MI perspective, right? That's really helping people to understand what the rule is and why they want to generate that rule. Like we all kind of go around walking around that way with our rules about how to interact with the world that we can think through. Yeah. And generating those is a combination of experience, observation, and hearing from other people, reading things we read a lot of books where we're like, oh, that's how I should do that.
Yeah.
It gave me some rules to guide how I interact with the world. And so I think that your point is a really great one about explaining the why helps to solidify what the rule is and why it's important.
Yeah, and I just kind of wonder with that is the I didn't do anything wrong response, which now I see is, again, working with teenagers, I'm not saying that 100% of those were legit, but I would say the majority probably are. They really didn't understand. And I look at that as failure of me and the systems that and programs I was running is we didn't really probably do enough of that background work, because the conversation we should have been having, whether a reward or consequence or whatever, was why do you think we're upset right now? Why do you think we're having this conversation? Why do you think that this hurts so-and-so's feelings? Having them understand sort of the why behind the rules, again, hopefully then that can translate into other settings as well, and help build those structures in the brain, prefrontal cortex and other things that, struggle with that initially coming out of those dysregulated situations. And so the kind of the final question that I have is, I think we would both agree just naturally that we want to create as safe an environment as possible, whether we're talking school, waiting room, interpersonal relationship, and a counseling sort of situation, that safety's got to be a number one priority. But let's say, we've established that. How do you see these approaches that we've been talking about? Intrinsic motivation, really well thought out systems to help people succeed behaviorally. How does that help folks heal from trauma? I know it probably doesn't in and of itself necessarily do it, but just kind of wonder if we go back to that trauma-informed lens and you think about all the treatment centers and the classrooms that have these sometimes incredibly rigid structures that probably neither of us would like if we were walking in as consultants. But in an ideal setting, how can these help be part of that healing and growth recovery process?
Yeah. I think one way that I think of kind of immediately is the idea of translating what I've learned in one environment to another.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that gets people really placed in some of these higher levels of care is because whatever is happening in the current environment, whether that be at home or outpatient, it's not working.
Yeah.
Right. And there often isn't enough clarity, and that can be hard to come by. In how to engage in this environment and how to then translate that into another environment. So a kid from a chaotic home go into a classroom, right? The two kind of systems of social governance in those two environments are very different. Yeah. And so being able to have very clear, I'll say the word expectation, right? But really it is very clear why we want to treat each other this way. Why do we want to do this? And how do you do it in an instructional way can be very helpful in creating safety for that particular child. And that could be somebody going from being homeless. There are different rules about living on the street than there are living in an apartment complex. And a lot of times that can be really confusing for people. So helping to make it less confusing and more clear is one way of really enhancing everybody's safety. From a physical standpoint, from a psychological, moral standpoint, all of those can be addressed by making things very, very clear about how we interact with each other and what the relational environment is like.
Great. Yeah. And I would, again, I think if we start from the point of safety's got to be there. And I think making sure that we balance, and this is why I think our jobs are so complex and so difficult, is we want to give an individual enough leeway, knowing that any of us trying to make behavioral changes will fail. Hey, think about change you've tried to make lately, and have you relapsed into past?
Always to keep trying.
Yep. And just think about the last diet you've tried, right? You do good all week, and then Friday it's nachos and pizza.
Yeah, it's not linear.
Yes, exactly. So having that flexibility on our part, and I think that the thing that is in the forefront of my mind, and I got to give Ross W. Green, who wrote Lost at School, and working with, I think it's Explosive Child's another one. I've got one on my list, Raising Human Beings. What he challenged with my thinking is to look at some of those behavioral issues that seem to create unsafe environments or really don't follow expectations, to step back and ask, okay, what skills does this kid lack to meet these expectations? And how can, when I kind of combine your thinking with the reading that I'm doing, how do we set the structured environment to ensure some level of safety? And I've seen so many people, including myself, that can be a little chaotic in my thinking at times. The structure helps create that safety in which I can then take healthy risks. I've got a great marriage, which I'm lucky to have. So my wife's okay if I go out and start my own business, start a podcast, travel around the country talking about my passion. I've got that, that safety, that security there. And, I think I would have been much more effective if we think about somebody, again, what I see in clinics is, okay, you missed a medical appointment and that disrupts everything in the clinic. And I get that there's consequences, but what skill set did that person lack, whether or not to make that appointment, and not jump to the assumption is, oh, they just don't value their medical care, right? Or that's just the bad kid. Hate that word, but that's, again, that label. That's the conduct disorder kid. And while those things can be very real, we also see a misdiagnosis with trauma on those. What skills do they need to really succeed at these behaviors that we're trying to reinforce? And I think if I would have stepped back and to say, okay, this kid keeps getting into fights. That's a behavior we need to address for safety reasons. But if I understand enough about the skills that person lacks, or maybe just what's going on within the milieu or the school, maybe I can teach the individual, not just with the rewards and consequences, but also hopefully giving them skills to succeed in whatever structure that we give. And that's I really like that kind of strength-based approach. Is how do we help them build different ways to act? Not just, again, punishment's not what we're supposed to do, but if we look at a lot of systems, that's what happens. Jump to that sort of response on our part. And I'm holding on to that because I think there's some gold there to be mined. And I'm interested to, right now I'm just cramming my brain with as much information as I can to see what comes out. But, if you haven't read any of Ross W. Green's work, I really think that he's putting out some really good ways of thinking that I think really kind of gets to the area between, or the combination between the approaches that we've talked about today, which I think is really exciting as well. So, yeah, it seems like this conversation is one that schools need to be having, treatment centers is okay, now we know about this neurobiology. We know some of the symptomatic behaviors from this neurobiology. How do we build skills for them to be successful that translates? And how do we set up our systems to create as much safety as possible? So we got, if you haven't checked out yet, in our show notes every week, we put in discussion questions. So I think this is whether, again, you're a medical clinic, whether you're a school, whether you're in early childhood education, maybe for your kids at home, whatever it is, I think this is an important discussion to have. And I'm sure not the last time you and I will have it, my friend, and probably not the last time we talk about it on this podcast as well. So
it takes a lot of discussion to integrate, ideas. And I think kind of my parting thought, I think, would be that I think our goal is really to as a group of professionals, to make sure that we're able to maintain flexibility in our thinking, to be able to engage with each other and do the right thing for children and for families and for any individual who's struggling, right? As a group of supporting professionals. I think that's the most important thing, and making sure that we're able to communicate with each other and have multiple discussions about these areas that is so important to integrate. That's kind of what I'd like to leave everybody with today, is kind of a charge to be thinking about that.
Great last words. So, friends, as always, you can find our show notes, videos at traumainformedlens.org. I also just want to throw out, there's something weird happening on YouTube right now, but one of our episodes when we talked about the Oprah, we now have 1,500 views on that, so it's kind of trending. So if you get a chance, I know I sent a lot of you out an email to say, hey, let's go viral. I don't even know what that would mean for us.
Hope it doesn't involve sneezing and
exactly. 1,500 views on YouTube is way more than I've ever got on anything. So if you got a moment to Google Trauma Informed Lens podcast, and go to, I think it's episode 26. It is episode 26. Even if you've heard it and you clicked on that, the more clicks we get, the more exposure we get. And again, our whole goal with this is to get not Curt and I's name out there to everybody, but really the research and what we see is the real transformational power of our message and the trauma-informed message out there. So if you got a second and you want to help us out and you haven't seen our smiling faces, if you could click on that, who knows, if we can get 100 more people familiar with what's going on around this movement, who knows how many lives that will impact. So, Curt, it's been a blast with you. Hopefully Jerry's shooting par or whatever the golf parlance is, with that. And again, traumainformedlens.org. Everybody have a good week. We'll see you next week.
Thanks.